Hello and welcome to the third installment in my series on the Qiao Vessels for the now published book, Archaeology of the Qiao Vessels. Today I'd like to touch on Hexagram Qi Theory, which is a theoretical model from the inner canon that I use in the book to analyze and describe yin-yang dynamics or Qi dynamics of Qiao vessel pathology. It can also be used to understand really any channel pathology, and insofar as it provides sort of a lucid mechanism, it's helpful in, as we'll see, it's helpful in directing our treatment protocols. Now, why did I choose to use this sort of arcane, not well-known theoretical model from the Suwen, or the simple questions? Part of the reason is because I find a lot of the more traditional means of describing the mechanisms and Qi dynamics involved in channel pathologies to be a bit lacking. So I want to talk a little bit about that and give two examples. Now, the first example is just explanation via the channel pathway. So for instance, I say, liver 3 treats testicular mounting pain. You can see that's in the AB Classic. In modern texts, we might see, okay, how are we going to describe or understand this mounting pain? Well, modern text might say, well, this is because the foot receding in channel passes through the genitals. Okay, that seems like a logical explanation, but the only problem is that it's just a kind of circular logic, because the very reason that the foot receding in channel passes through the genitals is just because liver 3 treats the genitals. You see, if we know something about how the channels were put together, we first had a pulse point, for instance, at the liver 3 pulse point. And then when we saw some sort of change in that pulse at liver 3, and then at the same time, we would also see, they might have also seen that it corresponded to certain diseases. For instance, like this mounting pain at the testicles. And so basically then eventually they began to treat at liver 3, doing acupuncture at liver 3, and finding that indeed it does help abate the pain. And so then this became, this sort of correspondence became what we now see as the channels. This is the idea promulgated by the scholar Huang Longxiang about how the channels came into existence. Basically, they started just as this map of correspondence between pulse points, namely the pulse points on the hands and feet, which we now think of as like the yuan acupoints, and then the diseases that they treat or that they indicate by means of changes to the pulse. So basically, it's just not saying anything. It's just saying, well, liver 3 treats testicular mounting pain because it treats it. It's not, it's not really giving us anything extra. At the same time, it's also very accurate, because it's saying, in another way, it's almost saying, well, liver 3 treats testicular mounting pain because people have found that it treats that, especially when there's some sort of change to the pulse, the palpable pulse at liver 3. So this channel pathway explanation is it's quite accurate in a way, in the way that I just described, but it's also, it's a bit unsatisfying. It doesn't give us much more than just telling us, well, experientially we've found this to be the case. it doesn't give us really a theoretical framework. And so the other way that people might think about approaching this question is via um, a explanation through organ function. So for instance, liver 3 treats testicular mounting pain. That's because liver rules coursing qi. Okay, well, the problem that I have with this is just that this idea of the organs being connected to the channels doesn't really exist until the spiritual pivot. And so, but we know that these correspondences predated the spiritual pivot. They there's whole lots of literature that comes out of Ma Wangdui or Zhang Jiasan, where these channels or these vessels are already being indicated for use in certain diseases. So it just doesn't, it's unsatisfying, and then it doesn't seem to be, it doesn't even seem to be the case that originally these channels were correlated with organs, right? And so the scholar Liao Yuchun out of China says, the Ma Wangdui text, the channel texts don't refer to organs. The only ones that do are the 10 questions, which is a sort of a health cultivation manual. So based upon this observation, Liao Yuchun basically thinks that this system of the organs was co-opted by the clinical medicine theoreticians. It didn't actually derive from their own system, and probably wasn't there early on, like for instance when they were developing these channel systems. And so furthermore, in the specific example of receding in, it's actually even difficult to say that the liver was really at all connected to receding in, even up through some of the texts represented in the Suwen, or the simple questions. So Huang Longxiang and the Japanese scholar Fujiki Toshiro both state that receding in of the Ma Wangdui texts, and as I said, the Suwen, do not link to the liver, but actually to the genitals. So you can see, for instance, the liver collateral channel, it links to the genitals, whereas most other collateral channels link to organs. And then the Ma Wangdui text, 11 channels of the feet and arms, has the receding yin channel end in the genitals. So that's quite different than other channels that would end maybe in the head, for instance, if they start in the feet. Now in Suwen 64, you can check and see there's all of these correspondences between, for instance, head and foot channels, and then various, hand and foot channels, and then various organs or organ pathologies. But interestingly, with Jueyin, or receding in, it's associated explicitly with the genitals. And so Huang Longxiang believes that actually the early form of receding yin was actually something closer, or in the receding yin vessel, was actually something closer to these kind of vessels we see sometimes in simple questions, or in these dictacs like Ma Wangdui, where we have stuff like the teeth vessel, the vessel of the back transport points, basically a vessel that's associated with treatment of a specific area, which in this case would have been the genitals. And so again, it's just, to a degree, it's questionable to explain these pathologies of the channels in terms of organ function dysfunction, because they weren't even all originally associated with organs. So that's sort of like a reverse engineering kind of approach. So I was looking for something a bit more contemporary, um, and what I found was that the hexagram Qi theory it was a contemporary theory of that time, sort of the Western Han, late Western Han, around 100 BC to sort of 0. And so it had that aspect, which was really good. And then the other aspect that it has is that hexagram Qi theory analyzes these pathologies in terms of yin-yang disharmonies, or sort of yin-yang dynamics. And as anyone who reads the book will see, this is really, really important for Qiao vessel pathology. So the classic of difficulties, it also talks about Qiao pathology this way: yang is urgent, yin is tranquil. And in the book, I talk about this yang repletion, yang stagnating in yin. So because it's mostly these pathologies that have to do with stagnation of yang in the brain or in the abdomen, this yin-yang dynamic and this above and below dynamic, which also exists a lot in this hexagram Qi theory, is very, very applicable. And it really gives us a sort of theoretical framework to work off of. So what is this hexagram Qi theory? Well, another more descriptive name for it is hexagrams depicting the waxing and waning of yin-yang through the 12 months. And so this was a theoretical model that became very, very popular in the late Western Han period, which again, this is when the Neijing, or the inner canon, would have been forming. Or at least a lot of the theory of it would have been forming. And this book was, this theoretical model was developed by Meng Xi, who was a scholar of the Book of Changes. So basically what he did a lot of pairings, but one thing he did was to pair each month with a hexagram, and in so doing reflect the yin-yang dynamic of that month and the change in the yin-yang dynamic over the course of a year. And so he developed this system. This system became very popular. And then what happened is, somewhere along the line, theoreticians of medicine, clinicians, adapted this system to the channels, and they paired the 6-foot channels with this hexagram model. It was also paired with the 12 pulse abnormalities of each vessel, but this was not included in the inner canon. And so, well, the best way to visualize this is just to have a look. So here it is. So you can see down there on the bottom, these are so here you can see the 12 hexagrams and their corresponding month. So there are a few things as you're looking here that you can sort of try to notice. The first thing to help you orient is going to be to look at the 10th month. And so when we look at the 10th month, we see that's all 6 Yao are yin. So that's all yin, that's the Kun hexagram. And so this just basically means in the 10th month, we're in complete yin territory. And then when we get into the 11th month, which is the Fu hexagram, meaning like return, then we have the return of yang, the very bottom there, with the red line refers to one yang returning. And so this would be at the winter solstice. So that would mean that we're currently, I guess we're in the 11th month right now, and then halfway through the 11th month is the winter solstice, if I have that right. So yeah, just so you know, these are the lunar months of the calendar, and not the solar calendar. And so then again, if you look at the 4th month, you see we have all 6 yang, so that's complete yang, which is the Qian hexagram. So then when we get to the 5th month, we have the return of yin. So once yang reaches its extreme, yin is engendered in the 5th month at the summer solstice. So this is typically happens in June. Again, so it's the lunar calendar, so it's like a month off. And this hexagram in the 5th month is called Go, and it means something like interchange, intercourse. It's talking about this handoff between yang and yin, with yin as is now going to slowly start growing and expanding. And so if you just look over the course of the whole year, you just see this gradual expansion and contraction of yin and yang, and that's the basic idea behind hexagram Qi. And then what the simple questions did, or it might have been done earlier, who knows, is they paired the 6-foot vessels with certain months in the calendar, so that they were also corresponding to particular hexagrams. So you can see in here lesser yin paired with the kun, all yin hexagram, greater yin with this fu hexagram, or where we have 1 yang returning, and so on and so forth. And so of course in the Qiao vessel theory, because the yang Qiao is the collateral of greater yang, the yin Qiao collateral is the collateral of lesser yin. Those are going to be the 2 ones that we're most concerned with in the book. We also look a little bit receding yin. But just to clarify, this hexagram Qi theory correspondence is actually going to be different from the way that 6 Qi theory pairs these with the months. So you see in 6 Qi theory, the greater yang is paired with the 10th month. It's just not the same. In fact, they're not. None of them are the same. So you can't confuse them. Although, as you'll see later on in this lecture, to a degree, you can use them to. You can still use these theories sort of to help explain each other. I'm not really in favor of saying, oh, you absolutely, can't. For instance, like in the Shanghan, you can't use 6G theory to explain the Shanghan Luan, or you can't use acupuncture channel theory to explain. I think to a degree, these ideas were all influencing each other. So, but I just wanted to make that clear that there is a difference. So before we get into how we can use this hexagram Qi theory to analyze these dynamics of pathology in the channels, I just want to sort of clarify a little bit more how exactly the Suwen applied this theory to the channels. So basically what they did was they wanted to use this theory, especially the hexagrams, to understand this yin-yang dynamic of pathology, disease in each of the 6-foot channels. It's important that these are all describing foot channel illnesses. And so another thing that's very interesting and is good to keep in mind is that in this commentary, the way they see the hexagrams are in a dynamic and unfolding context. So it's very interesting when you look at each of the passages, and I encourage people to look at them. You'll see that different diseases are described in different sort of aspects or different reflections upon the core dynamic at work in any one hexagram. And so it gives you a feel for that because, of course, this hexagram, in a sense, it's assigned to a large period of time. So you can imagine if it's a month, for instance, it's going to go through two jie, right? Yeah, it's going to go through two jie qi, right? Two modes of a year. And so obviously the sort of the qi of the year, the movement of the year is changing as time goes by. So that's just an interesting thing to note. And then another thing to clarify is just that this is not actually a explicit commentary of the Ling Shu 10. It doesn't use any channel theory. It only discusses the root branch pulse abnormalities, what in Chinese are called 时动, or when this is stirred illnesses. So these refer also to, these from the very beginning in Ma Wangdui's text, these were the first kind of diseases to be identified, those that were associated with changes to the pulse, for instance, the pulsing point of each channel. This would be compared with the produced by or 所生病 diseases, which many people think were just diseases that were assigned to channels based upon the pathway of the channel. So if you had some problem manifesting in the lateral elbow or something, maybe it's going to be on the small intestine or something of that manner. So that would be the difference between 所生病 or produced by and 视动, which is when this is stirred. So something to keep in mind. And the other thing is that it doesn't, it refers specifically to diseases that only exist in the Ma Wangdui text and don't in the LS10. So just so we know, it goes back further. Indeed, it might be talking about a lot of diseases that do exist in the LS10, but it's not limited to that. And it just shows that it's a sort of very old tradition that goes back to the very formation of the channels and channel theory. So without further ado, let's move right into this analysis in the Suwen, where we see how they apply hexagram theory to disease pathology. So this is again from the Suwen 49. It says, as for swelling and pain of the lower back, manifesting when there is abnormal pulsation in the pulse point of the foot, greater yang, this is because in the first lunar month of the year, yang qi emerges above, but yin qi is still abundant. As yang has yet to assume command, swollenness and lower back pain result. Okay, so the first thing to look at here is that I actually kind of forgot to mention this. The first month refers to the new spring, so sort of like the just what in the lunar calendar is the beginning of spring. So that's important, and that's related to greater yang, which might be different, you know, that's obviously different from what we're used to with the 6 Qi assignments. So in the first, this is Huang Yuanyu's take on this. He says, in the first lunar month of the year, yang qi emerges from below the ground to above the ground, but yin qi is still abundant. Thus, yang has yet to assume the commanding role above the ground. As such, wood qi struggles, surges against constraint. And as a result, we have back pain or swelling. And so this is what I would term sort of the natural disposition, or sort of the vulnerable disposition of greater yang. As we'll see in the next, in a slide later, greater yang has its movement is outward. It's this yang qi moving outward, but then at the same time, because it's, as we recall, it's 3 yin and 3 yang, especially at the beginning of this time period, it's struggling against yang to a degree and might not always prevail. And as a result, in this case, we get this back pain. And so one thing that I wanted to look at here, which I thought was really interesting, and it goes again to this very early understanding of yin-yang dynamics, is something that Huang Yuanyu brought up about this yang emerging from below the ground to above the ground. So let's have a look at that. So this is sort of like a geeky aside, but I think it's also a very interesting sort of window into the early Chinese psyche, how they perceived yin-yang dynamics in a very sort of just tactile or practical way. And so this comes from the Guoyu, out of the Warring States a long time ago. And it's a description of, again, this yin-yang dynamic at spring. So it says, in times of old, the celestial minister would examine the earth at given times. When yang becomes replete and tumid within the ground, the earth qi stirs and emanates. Farmer's auspice culminates at dawn, and the sun and moon are beneath the celestial temple, at which time the soil's qi emerges in pulses. From now until the first week of the new lunar month, and this is talking about the beginning of spring, yang qi is steaming upwards, the earth greases are flowing. If one does not stir and change or turn over the soil, the vessels, which means like the channels or the mai of the earth, will stagnate in repletion and crops will suffer. So here we really have a picture into the mind of the sort of like warring state perception of yin-yang through a very practical and palpable sort of analogy. But this is indeed, it's not an analogy, this is what they actually believed. That in early spring, the yang qi would start to sort of steam up through these vessels in the ground and try to raise up out of the ground. And so if during that time you didn't plant crops and you didn't stir or till the soil, then the earth qi would become stagnant, and it might lead to earthquakes or all sorts of other disasters. And so looking at certain signs, like for instance this farmer's auspice, would have been very, very important. And so it was this awareness that at spring qi emerges from the ground, but in that process of emerging there's the potential for stagnation, and there's a difficult struggling period basically at this jie qi, or this mode of the year. And so this is really the exact sort of symbolic model that we see these Suwen people, or the Simple Questions 49 author, working with in their understanding of the qi dynamic of the greater yang. So now we understand the core pathology, or the core vulnerability of the greater yang in terms of this hexagram qi, where yang in the ground has to move out of the ground, and as it passes through this node, which, in terms of time, it's represented by the new year, the spring, and this jie-qi, or node, which are always difficult passages for qi to go through. And then in terms of symbolically, it's represented by earth, and moving from below the earth to above the surface, passing through that surface. And in the body, it's emerging from the terra, the abdomen area, and moving out, maybe passing through the triple burner, moving out to the surface, and then collecting back into the head. So in any case, there's that difficulty and that vulnerability where you're still pressing against this yin-qi, which is above the yang in this hexagram, the Tai hexagram. And so at least at the beginning, the yang is not quite as strong. So now we can look even further and try to apply some more theory to explain why why someone would succumb to this vulnerability. Again, we're focusing on greater yang here because the yang Qiao vessel is a collateral of the greater yang channel. So when there's some sort of pathology in greater yang, it's going to manifest very likely in the collateral of that channel, or it has the potential to do so. So to understand yang Qiao pathology, we first have to understand greater yang mechanisms of pathology. So a good person to look to for that is Liu Duzhou, the Beijing University of Chinese Medicine professor. And he says, Wu Kun stated, Wu Kun is a theoretician, Chinese clinician from the Ming Dynasty. Greater yang is on the surface. It opens by coursing and diffusing yang qi outwards. Greater yang relies on the yang qi of the kidney and du vessel to support it. Lesser yin warms and transforms the cold water of greater yang, steaming it as qi. So this is an interesting vision of greater yang because it almost sounds a little bit like the liver. And again, this is why I think it's good to not consider the vessels sometimes in terms of organ pathology, because indeed they don't necessarily always match. But the important thing to understand here is, we have again this idea of yang qi moving outwards, and then what propels it outwards is the fire of the kidney. So the fire of the kidney, or of lesser yin, there I go again talking about organs right after I said not to, it transforms that cold water, right, greater yang cold water, into qi to move outwards. So if that kidney yang, or lesser yin transformative function is weak, then, well, of course, this qi can't transform, it can't move outwards. And so that's why we see a lot of times this pairing, or this appearance of lesser yin pathologies, symptomologies in the greater yang section. They're related by root and branch, and just by like a sort of like Qi Hua theory too. And so to give a specific example, relates to back pain, look at 桂枝父子汤, right? Cold damage for 8 to 9 days, wind and damp mutually struggle. There's pain, irritability, and an inability to twist at the waist. 桂枝父子汤 rules. So this is in the Taiyang, the Greater Yang section, but it actually involves this weakness of the Xiaoyin transformative function. And as a result, we have to add 父子 to the Guizhitang formula to assist in that transformation and allow yang qi to move outwards and pervade the surface of the body. And so, in this case, this we see here we have an inability to twist at the waist. So it's very similar to a degree to the kind of mechanism we're talking about here in this Hexagram Qi Theory model. And so basically you have greater yang, but then greater yang is always sort of in a dialectic with lesser yin. The two have to be considered together. So here below I say, we talked about this natural disposition, which is this difficulty in this transition out from within the earth to above the earth and against the pervading and abundant yin qi. And then we have the exacerbating factor. So one exacerbating factor would and could be a weak constitution, a weak Shaolin fire, which doesn't allow for this qi to steam upwards and outwards. And another exacerbating factor would be cold invasion. So even more yin qi above, making it even that more difficult for the Taiyang, this greater yang qi, to move outwards and out into the surface. So we've established sort of the natural predilection, the natural vulnerability of the greater yang, and we've looked at the exacerbating factors. Now the question is how to apply that to the Qiao vessels. So the first question is, does, for instance, back pain even show up in Yang Qiao symptomology? And the answer is yes. Yeah, it's in the Classic of the Bright Hall, the Pulse Classic, Prescriptions Worth 1,000 Gold, and many more going all the way up. So that's no question. And as it turns out, in the book, I do describe just this very same dynamic happening that I just described in terms of the yin Qiao and the yang Qiao vessel. So I said, again, using Huang Yuanyu contends that mounting pain, this is mounting pain, but it also applies to back pain, occurs when wood qi, which he describes as the yang of the Lord Jiao, which steams upwards, attempts to ascend and effuse upward and outward, but is blocked by yin evil, which we can understand as either externally or internally derived replete cold. This struggle, or effusing against replete cold's resistance, manifests as mounting pain. So again, it's this struggle, right at the surface, right at this moving out from within the earth to out of the earth, against this gradient of yin qi, which results in this kind of pain. And so we would expect to see that in yang Qiao symptomology as well, insofar as it's deeply related to greater yang. Now, how would we treat that? So this is an interesting thing. What we're looking to do, right, is guide yang to be able to effuse outwards. Now, there's a couple things that we can do in this situation. The first thing that we can do is use the approach that the spiritual pivot gives us in chapter 28. We can look at this case. So it says, what is the qi dynamic involved in sobbing or crying loudly while gasping for breath, if you can picture that? Qibo responded, in such cases, yin qi is replete, while yang qi is vacuous. Yin qi is urgent and yang qi is tranquil. Yin qi is abundant and yang qi is expiring. This is the nature of sobbing. Treat by supplementing foot greater yang and draining foot lesser yin. So the first thing to establish was meant by this yin qi and yang qi. Basically, here the way to read this is yin qi means the sort of the qi that's in the yin phase, where yang qi means the qi that's in the yang phase, so like on the surface or in the brain. And so this is saying yin qi is replete. So basically it's saying all of the yin qi is now in the yin phase. There's no qi, yang qi in the yang phase. Basically what that means is that yin qi, yang qi or qi is unable to disperse outwards and upwards into the yang phase, the surface of the body, into the brain. And so that's how they're analyzing that yin-yang dynamic. And you get this sobbing, this sort of where it basically kind of sounds like you're trying to get that qi to come upwards, but it's just it's locked inside. And so they say to treat by supplementing foot greater yang. In the Lei Jing, in Zhang Jingyue's commentary, he explicitly says that this what's meant by foot greater yang is BL 62 Shenmai, like the point for yang qiao. And same with foot lesser yin. This is Qi 6 or Zhao Hai for the yin qiao. So he explicitly says that. And so basically what we can say is that in these cases where we have this like yin or yang qiao pathology, in this case it's yang qiao pathology, where yang qi is unable to outbear, one thing that you can do is to supplement using needling at BL 62 and draining at foot lesser yin. So again, draining somehow means that as yin qiao is working as like a collateral, it sort of shunts qi out of the abdomen section into the circulation, and it then can go out into the surface of the body. So that's one approach that one could use in dealing with this yin-yang dynamic that we just spoke about. Now, another approach is to, let's say that this is occurring as a result of a deficiency of this sort of qi transformation in the lesser yin. Then maybe what we want to do is to moxa. Again, you could moxa again at Zhao Hai, at Qi 6, and in so doing, fire up this this Qi or Qi yang, and allow it to spur the outbearing of qi through greater yang and upwards. So that would be another approach. Both of these, I think, are quite viable, and both really make sense as elucidated through this hexagram model that we've just been discussing. So the goal of this talk was really just to give people an idea, a deeper background on hexagram Qi theory, and how it's applied to understanding Qiao vessel pathology, because within the space of the book, there's not a lot of time to go deep into the history or into my whole rationale, and so it might sort of come out of left field for some people, but hopefully through this talk people have a better understanding of why I would use it. and maybe be interested in researching this very intriguing chapter themselves. And so today that was what the main, I was just giving a sample with this back pain, but I wanted to mention that the greater yang section is quite large. And as I said, the core pathology is really this derangement of yang qi in the process of emerging from below to above. This can mean an inability to emerge, which manifests as back pain. But as I said, it's a process. It's a thing expanding in time. So this dynamic actually changes in different, as we go from one jie-qi, one 15-day period to the next. And again, as we get deeper into the first month of the new year and yang continues to grow, we might actually get to a place of overabundant surging. So again, it's the derangement of yang qi emerging is that it emerges too much. It goes overboard. So this is again part of its vulnerability. As yang qi surges and struggles against yin in these early days of the spring, it might be the case that this surge and struggle causes an overabundance, a too sort of rigorous movement upwards. And so indeed we see this in greater yang and in yang qiao pathology. So we have, for instance, the quote, as for rigor of, this is also from Suwen 49, as for rigor of the neck, radiant to the back, yang qi vigorously ascends and struggles above, causing this rigor. And so what is this? Some people might interpret this as being part of, in yang qiao pathology, we have epilepsy. And so a person sort of like suddenly having this like rigor in the back sort of is one possible manifestation. But again, just saying that this core pathology can manifest in different ways. And so in the book, we go further into that particular manifestation and other manifestations of yang qiao pathology as understood through hexagram qi mechanisms. And as we could imagine, a treatment for this might involve, instead of supplementing the Qiao vessel and helping yang qi to emerge, we might actually need to drain. So drain from BL62, allow some of that yang qi to drain out of the yang phase, or the head, the brain, in my opinion. And then insofar as this might, an exacerbating cause of this might be wind, we might also look at wind points. So we have this sort of like a root and branch treatment, one looking at the core pathology, another looking at this exacerbating factors. And I think that's a good way of treating qiao pathology based on this hexagram qi. So that's all for now, and probably concludes my series of talks, unless people really have other things that they're curious about. This is all from my book, which is now published, called An Archaeology of the Qiao Vessels. It was edited by the very talented Michael Brown and Alan Soar, with the silent T, and a foreword by Heiner Freuhoff. I hope I'm probably butchering that, I'm sorry. And it's available at the Purple Cloud Institute website. It's cheaper there than on Amazon, so be sure to check that out, and thank you.